Hey folks, this is Kalani. The War Within expansion is quickly approaching, which means we don't have too much longer to lock in our main characters. That first character has to be a good one, right? Well, we're going to go through every melee spec and see which ones are going to be on top for single target, who's dishing out some great AoE, and which ones look good overall. We're also going to talk about hero talent trees, how they change up your rotation, whether or not they look cool, and whether or not you can actually tell they are there, because some of them are so passive you won't even notice. So here's our list of melee DPS ranked for the War Within and which ones are looking to be on top for the start of the new expansion. Now before we jump in, be sure to hit up that like button and subscribe so you never miss another video. Let's kick things off with the warriors, starting with Arms. Arms has had quite a few changes so far. The main difference going into the next expansion is that you won't be generating as much rage, but pretty much everything will cost less rage as well. Thankfully, that does leave you in a place where you're not really waiting that often for auto attacks to generate rage to actually use an ability, so it's definitely not as slow as it has been in the past. The general theme and key abilities haven't changed too much. You're still the two-handed weapon specialist, dealing massive damage with mortal strikes, keeping your foes bleeding with rend, and overpowering them whenever you can. There's some cool changes with Cleave and the talents that really focus in on big AoE pulls. There's definitely a lot of potential for both single target damage and AoE, but the gameplay and rotation don't feel too smooth, especially when compared to some other melee classes, and even Fury Warrior, which we'll touch on in a moment. As far as hero talents go, they're not great. Colossus gives you a new ability, Demolish, which deals a lot of damage, but you can't really move while casting it. I've personally never liked being locked into these kinds of animation-based abilities. It's an easy way to catch a stray fireball or swirly, especially in hectic raid encounters. The big hits are fun, but that's all the hero talent tree really has going for it. The Slayer hero talents are actually less interesting, mostly because they don't really change too much about how your abilities work, and there aren't really any cool visuals either. There are no new animations or effects from what I can tell, but hopefully that changes before we hit live servers. Slayer revolves around Execute and Bladestorm, empowering those abilities and giving you access to them more often. Bladestorming more is always fun, but that's kind of all it has going for it. There are also quite a few buttons and minor cooldowns to manage, and the rotation feels okay at best. At least you're not super range starved though, that would have made things even worse. I'm going to put Arms in the B tier. Moving on to the Fury Warriors, grab that second big axe or sword or mace because you're going to need it to smash some mobs to pieces. Fury hasn't changed all that much in how it really plays either, except Bloodthirst got buffed quite significantly, so it's back to being a high priority ability, and you'll probably be weaving spells around its cooldown. Personally, I find Fury a lot smoother rotation wise, and it's actually really enjoyable to play. You've got some beefy cooldowns, a few different options for talents and setups, and some good utility thrown in there as well. The only problem I have with Fury, and I guess the same thing really goes for Arms, is that there isn't anything too exciting going on with them right now. It's kind of the same old, but if you play Warrior right now and you love how it plays, that's maybe not a bad thing. As for the hero talents, Mountain Thane is really cool. It powers up Avatar and Thunderclap, making them both more potent, but also giving you more access to Avatar, which is always fun. The aesthetics are really cool, especially when Thunderclap turns into Thunderblast, and at least you actually have some new visuals with this hero talent tree in play. Mountain Thane also basically replaces Whirlwind with Thunderclap in your rotation, which feels way better than it probably sounds, and Mountain Thane is definitely my favourite hero talent tree for the Warriors right now. The Slayer hero talent tree is pretty much the same as it is for Arms. It doesn't do anything super flashy, isn't all too interesting, and doesn't change much about the buttons you press. The Thunder and Lightning theme of the Mountain Thane is way more interesting to me, but with smooth gameplay, the one good hero talent tree, good options for single target and amazing AoE potential, Fury just and so lands a spot in the A tier for me. Let's check out the Survival Hunters next. Survival was recently changed quite significantly and it's currently in a really good spot. If you love throwing explosives into big packs of mobs, you're in the right place. Wildfire bombs are simpler to use, there are no rotating buffs to manage with Wildfire Infusion, and the dot doesn't override itself, it adds the damage just like Ignite. Tip of the Spear now boosts damage from any ability, and your major cooldowns are easier to use too. Explosive Shot also became super important and interacts with your other abilities in cool new ways, so you have even more bombs to throw into your enemies' faces. It's satisfying to play, you have a lot of great options for ramping single target damage or exploding everything in AoE, and overall it's been made much easier to pick up and understand. It's actually one of my favourite melee specs to play right now. The hero talents are where things get a bit iffy, because it really feels like Sentinel was made for marksmanship, Pack Leader was made for beast mastery, and then Survival just kinda gets stuck in the middle, picking between the two. Sentinel revolves around a stacking debuff that you can interact with in a few ways, like dealing massive amounts of AoE damage as the stacks start to ramp up, but the main thing you have to play around is Lunar Storm. Every 15 seconds, your next wildfire bomb will also summon an owl that fires at enemies within 10 yards. The main problem is that the AoE stays where you activate it, so if the trash mobs or bosses move out of that area, you are going to lose a lot of damage. Playing around a static AoE can be quite annoying, but the other hero talent tree isn't any better. Pack Leader focuses on buffing your pet, its basic attacks and kill command more than anything else, so not only is it not super great thematically for Survival, but it doesn't really boost any of Survival's key abilities in any meaningful way either. Despite that, Survival is actually doing ridiculous amounts of damage, but I'm going to try and ignore that because balance tuning could swing either way before the expansion launches. With all of that in mind, Survival lands comfortably in the A tier for my list. Let's take a look at Ret Paladins next, because oh boy are Ret Paladins looking good. The embodiment of a holy warrior, Ret Paladins wield light and might to take down their foes. The rotation for Ret is super smooth, probably one of my favourites right now, and you have great options for single target and AoE. You can make pretty much any ability hit multiple targets, which also makes it easy to switch between the playstyles. You can also get wings every time you use Wake of Ashes, which is really fun to play around with, and I also love that their main cooldowns are very short, so you get to use them very often. It's quite familiar if you played it through Dragonflight, with some very nice quality of life upgrades and new talents to change up how you play. Paladins are also generally quite versatile. Between the various blessings, easy off heals and life-saving buffs, they bring some amazing utility to any group, which is always a plus. The rotation is smooth, spells and abilities are impactful, and the cooldowns are really cool. They also have some of the better hero talent trees. Templar is all about massive damage with big hammers, and I mean massive damage. Their new ability hits like a truck, and you can cast it twice in a row sometimes. The other talents focus on various buffs and little hammers, but that big hammer of light is where it's at. If you want to be the unstoppable holy warrior with big hits, you're gonna love the Templar hero talents. Herald of the Sun is a bit different. It emphasizes a paladin's connection to the light of the sun. Your abilities create these sunspots on enemies which deal damage over time, and you get a nice haste buff for each one active, but the really cool stuff happens when you use Avenging Wrath. Not only do you apply more of these sunspots, so you deal a bunch more damage and get that sweet haste buff, but all of the debuffs connect with these solar lines, which also deal damage and healing. It looks cool, has some nice bonuses, and it fits the paladin theme quite well. Putting all of that together, Ret Paladin becomes the first spec joining the S tier for my list. Moving on, Havoc Demon Hunters are in an interesting spot because they haven't really seen too many changes so far. The class and spec talent trees are mostly the same as they are on live, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You're still backflipping, fell rushing, eye-beaming, chaos striking, turning into a big demon and slicing everything in your path. If you enjoy Demon Hunter and Dragonflight, you know what to expect. Personally, I really enjoy the playstyle, and Havoc has always been one of my favourite melee specs to play. Eye-beam is just too much fun. So where things are going to change are with the hero talents, and it's kind of interesting because Demon Hunter only has 2 specs, which means both specs have the same hero talent trees, and it feels kind of like one was made with Havoc in mind, while the other one was made with Vengeance in mind. Aldrachi Reaver gives you an empowered glaive, the Reaver's Glaive, which empowers your abilities and provides different benefits when you change the order in which you use them, so it can actually change your rotation depending on your situation, and there are some big damage boosts in here. The problem is that triggering your Reaver's Glaive requires you to consume soul fragments or cast the Hunt. So you have one guaranteed trigger, but to reliably get these hero talents rolling, you'll need to generate and consume soul fragments, which is very easy for Vengeance. They do it more or less passively, but you're kind of stuck just running around collecting them as Havoc, so that's definitely not ideal. The other option is Felscarred, which focuses more on demonic and metamorphosis to deal extra damage and grant you various buffs. There are even buffs that carry over after your demon form ends, so it's not just piling more damage into your existing damage windows, you do get some great buffs for the in-between time as well. It's a lot of fun and it feels really powerful. With a great kit, fun abilities and some interesting hero talents, Havoc Demon Hunter lands squarely in the A tier. Let's tackle the rogues next, starting with Outlaw, our swashbuckling, sword-swinging, sneaky dice rollers. Quite a few talents have shifted around for Outlaw, so you might not be able to pick up all of the same talents you can in Dragonflight, and you're also losing Shadow Dance, which means you're relying on Vanish for any extra stealth windows now. There are a few more options in different ways to play, but for the most part it plays like Dragonflight, just with less Shadow Dance. Outlaw is still one of the fastest melee specs to play. It almost seems like the faster you can play it, the better you're going to do, so if you handle the RPM, it might be a fun spec for you to pick up and play. Where rogues disappoint right now are with their hero talents. The first option is Fatebound, which is really cool thematically. It all revolves around the flip of a coin, so it's got gambling, luck of the draw rogue written all over it, which I really love. The downside is that you don't have any exciting visuals to go along with your coin toss. You do throw out a little coin, but that's kind of it, and you are not going to see that when things start to get busy in melee. All of the bonuses and pretty much everything happening is also in the background. They don't change how you play and you don't interact with your coin at all really, so it's just a passive buff with a bit of RNG sprinkled in. The other option is the Trickster tree. You attack with Unseen Blades when using other abilities, dealing damage and applying a new debuff that briefly increases your damage to the target, and then every 4 Unseen Blades powers up your next dispatch. There's also a handful of options that cause Killing Spree to interact with the hero talent mechanics, but that's kind of it. Nothing particularly flashy or interesting or exciting, and just like Fatebound, it's mostly happening in the background. So the hero talents are a bit lackluster, but Outlaw Rogue itself is still fun to play, especially if you love mashing buttons. It should also do pretty well for itself in AoE especially, so it's going to land in the B tier for me. Moving on, let's talk about Assassination. Just like Outlaw, there are a handful of changes for Assassination. Shadow Dance was removed, and Kingsbane was limited to about half of its previous potential, so we could see some shift arounds in what talents are played and some variety there. But you're still the poison and bleed focused spec, and the general gameplay hasn't changed all too much. I also feel like Assassination takes a lot of work to get any damage out of it. There's a lot more to keep track of versus Outlaw Rogue, for example, and way more than some of the easier melee specs on offer. If they end up doing amazing damage, that would definitely be worth it, but that's going to come down to tuning at the end of the day. Assassination feels okay to play, but with nothing super exciting on the table, it feels just a bit meh. Personally, I've always preferred Outlaw. I think it plays much better, and the hero talents definitely don't help either. Assassination could go Deathstalker, which is all about focusing in on one target and killing it efficiently. That's the actual assassin theme. That kind of fits sub-rogues more these days, but it's a cool idea nonetheless. You mark your target, deal extra damage to them, and you can deal massive damage to low health enemies too. You can only mark one target though, so that's going to skew how useful these bonuses can be in different types of content. It's an interesting premise, I like the fantasy of it, but outside of the mark doing a bit of extra damage when you use combo points, there's not much actually happening. And then the other hero talent option for Assassination is Fatebound, so you get to flip the coin and enjoy whatever passive bonuses you end up with. You don't really feel these hero talents while you're playing, so it's kind of hard to get excited about them in my opinion. With all that in mind, Assassination is going to end up in the C tier for me. And then the last rogue spec under the magnifying glass is Subtlety. As mentioned earlier, Sub-Rogue will be the only one shadow dancing going forward, so they've reclaimed that as a spec exclusive ability. There are a handful of other changes too, but nothing all too crazy. You're still the stealthy, sneaky, stealth again, deal as much damage as you can before stealthing yet again rogue spec. It's also still one of the most complicated melee specs to play, and that seems to have been the Subtlety special in the most recent expansions, and it doesn't look to be changing with the War Within. That means you are relying entirely on theory crafters to figure out how to best make use of the rogue class changes or the hero talent, and even then is a lot to get your head around. Playing Subtlety effectively is pretty difficult, and with everything put together, Sub just feels okay to me. For the hero talents, Subtlety gets to pick between Trickster, which gives you those free attacks, new debuffs, some extra AoE potential for sub and the empowered spenders, or Deathstalker, which as we just talked about has an interesting premise, but doesn't really have too much going on. So the hero talent choices only drag sub down further for me, so it's going to go in the C tier alongside its Assassination sibling. Feral Druids are next, and the main abilities and components are largely the same, with a big focus on bleeds, which can be hard to get used to initially, but thankfully there are plenty of ways to apply bleeds to multiple targets, so Feral plays a lot better than it has in some past expansions. When it comes to AoE and content like dungeons, there are a handful of fun new additions, and the talent tree has been shifted around a bit, so that could create some new builds, but you're still applying your bleeds and spending any excess time and energy on biting stuff as hard as you can. The rotation is okay, there are quite a few moving parts, so you do have to keep on top of all of them, so it's not as smooth as some other melee specs in my opinion. I'm also not really a fan of how many talents you need to pick up in order to get the most out of their major cooldown in Berserk. There could be a lot more interesting talents to choose from in that cluster. Maybe we'll see more changes before the expansion goes live. It is worth noting that as a druid you have amazing flexibility and some great utility as well, so they will always be valuable in any group. Now their hero talents aren't too bad. Druid of the Claw focuses on physical damage, which can turn your ferocious bite into Ravage, which looks cool and deals AoE damage, but you don't get it very often outside of Berserk, which is a bit of a shame. It also applies yet another bleed effect, so it's definitely on theme for feral druids, but that's kind of it. The Wildstalker set is a bit different because it shares with Restoration Druid. This one focuses on Bloodseeker Vines, which can grow when your bleeds deal damage. There's some good AoE potential here too, because you can spread the vines and they explode when you ferocious bite or when they expire, and they provide a decent damage boost to their targets too, but almost all of that will be happening in the background, so there's not much active gameplay here. So the hero talents to me aren't the worst of the bunch by far, but they're nothing too special either. Very middle of the pack. With all of that put together, I think Feral belongs in the B tier. Enhancement Shamans are up next, and they're a little disappointing. Not because they're bad or anything, but when the Shamans were promised a rework, you would assume all three specs would be involved. Sadly, while Elemental and Resto got some big changes, Enhancement didn't. The class talent tree did see some new stuff, but Enhancement itself is mostly just the same as Dragonflight, and the dev team have said that they plan on keeping it that way. The one big thing that they did get along with the other Shamans is a new raid buff, Sky Fury. This provides 2% mastery and the Wind Fury effect to your entire part of your raid, so there'll be no more Wind Fury groups and everyone is going to want at least one Shaman, so that's great news. Enhancement itself can be quite awkward to play. There are a lot of procs and quite a lot of abilities as you weave melee skills with quickened spells. It can also be very fast paced and kind of like playing whack-a-mole, but if you can keep on top of everything it can also be quite satisfying. It's particularly fun in AoE where almost everything spreads or cleaves and you can shoot out chain lightning as often as possible to zap everything to death. As for the hero talents, there are some cool options in here too. Totemic doubles down on totems, giving you a new Surging Totem to deal AoE damage. There are various passives to boost its damage, you can summon other totems and empower them, and they interact with certain talents, which will definitely pigeonhole you into different talent choices, which isn't super ideal, but I think it's fine if the results are good. The big problem right now is that the most recent changes actually broke the Totemic hero talents. It kind of just doesn't work anymore for Enhancement, so when that gets fixed, it's an interesting setup, especially if you love the totems aspect of Shaman. The other set of hero talents is Stormbringer. This one can change your Lightning Bolt into Tempest, dealing AoE damage and triggering various bonuses. It also gives you more access to instant empowered chain lightnings, which is always a lot of fun. Sadly, the Tempest ability's visuals do leave something to be desired. It's more of a pulse of lightning, which looks quite sad next to things like chain lightning. Either way, if you love the lightning theme, then I'm sure you'll get a kick out of Stormbringer. I don't enjoy it as much as some of the other melee specs, and it's a bit broken on the beta right now, so Enhancement lands in the B tier for me. Now, one spec that has seen a huge rework going into the War Within are Windwalker Monks, and what a great job they've done. There are a few distinct ways to play, depending on which facet of Windwalker you want to lean into, with new talents and abilities to power up your favourite options. It's really hard to cover everything because Monk and Windwalker especially has probably seen the most changes in the beta so far, and you have even more strong options for AoE, if that's even possible, including cleaving blackout kicks, which is awesome when combined with the free multiple blackout kicks, or you can pretend to be an elemental shaman with massive AoE crackling chain lightnings. Monk remains as one of the most mobile classes as well, so they almost have a perfect package. It feels smooth to play, I love how many options there are, and I think it's in a great spot as we head into the new expansion. The hero talents are thematically cool too. Conduit of the Celestials turns you into a literal conduit, channeling the power of the August Celestials to deal massive AoE damage, but as you fight, each Celestial also aids you in combat, contributing something different. There's also an effect that speeds up your major cooldowns significantly, so you get to push those fun buttons more as well. The other option is Shadowpan, which builds up charges of flurry strikes that are unleashed all at once, dealing heavy damage. There are also some massive buffs that you can proc, but it seems like the result is random, which does introduce a good dollop of RNG into the tree. Sadly, most of the tree does happen in the background, without really changing much about how you play or what you prioritize. Still, if you like punching stuff, the tree lets you punch stuff more, so it's definitely on theme for Windwalker. With a fantastic rework, plenty of options, smooth gameplay, great mobility, and some fun hero talents, Windwalker Monk lands comfortably in the S tier for my list. Alright, let's round things out with the Death Knights. Frost saw a handful of changes and quite a few new talents that offer different ways to play, but the basic gameplay remains familiar. So if you've played Frost Death Knight semi-recently, you know what you're signing up for. There are options to pump your single target damage and focus on Obliterate, and lots of different ways to deal big AoE and cleave damage. Frost Scythe was changed into more of a mini cooldown, and there are also quite a lot of new talents that interact with your auto attacks, so if you prefer more of a passive playstyle, Frost might be a good pickup too. Breath of Sindragosa is still an option, so if you love that runic power race, you can get some great numbers with Breath. The general fantasy of Frost Death Knight is also really cool. You embody an unrelenting frozen storm, smashing and slashing your foes with ice and snow. There's no question you're a Frost Death Knight. I mean, who else gets to summon an undead frostworm to breathe across the entire battlefield and accidentally pull the boss? No one. It plays really smooth, you have a lot of different ways to play, and the abilities are impactful. What's not to like? The hero talents for Death Knights are also really cool. Rider of the Apocalypse lets you summon the 4 Horsemen, which do different things. Amazing class fantasy, though it is a bit more passive than I was hoping. The really cool part though is that you summon all 4 Horsemen whenever you use Frostworm's Fury, so that lets you create these big damage windows where all 4 bonuses are active, and you can guarantee that. The other option is Deathbringer, which focuses on a new Reaper's Mark ability. You mark an enemy, and whenever you deal shadow or frost damage, you build up stacks, and it eventually explodes. There are so many other AoE options in here, summoning scythes to slash your foes, creating waves of shadow frost damage. It's super cool to play around with and has some nice visuals too. Death Knights might actually have some of the best hero talents right now in my opinion, so Frost makes it into the A tier for me. Now, Unholy Death Knights are shaping up very well too. Sudden Doom was changed to interact with Festering Wounds and proc more reliably, so that's kinda cool, and pretty much all of your cooldowns were reduced, so you'll have access to them more often, including Army of the Dead coming down to a 3-minute cooldown, which can also be replaced with an Abomination on a shorter cooldown. So you can have your typical mini army, or you can just straight up summon an Abomination. That is the ultimate Unholy DK fantasy right there. There are more ways to spread and apply Festering Wounds to multiple enemies, like Festering Scythe, which is really satisfying to use, and your general goals seem to be the same. Keep the diseases running, apply and pop your wounds, and deal as much damage as you can. Unholy is way more complicated when compared to Frost though, in my opinion, as well as compared to some other melee specs. You have so much more to manage, which can be fun if you love playing minigames within minigames, or it could end up being too much for some players. When it all lines up and you get the rotation down, it is a very satisfying spec to play. For hero talents, you get the Riders of the Apocalypse, so those potential 4 passive bonuses, or all 4 at once whenever you use Army of the Dead. Summoning the 4 Horsemen will always be a win for DK Fantasy, and it feels great for Unholy DK too, or you can go for San Lane, which feels more like a Blood DK thing with the whole blood theme and focus, but it actually plays really well. Your Scourge Strike can be replaced with Vampiric Strike, giving you extra healing, a haste buff, and some extra damage buffs. During Dark Transformation, you always have Vampiric Strike, and the haste buff goes crazy. So you can have even more haste to work with while using Sam Lane. It's fun to play with, but there isn't anything too special on the visual front. With all of that in mind, Unholy rounds out our list at the top of the A tier. But that's how I would rank the melee specs as they stand right now. Some of them could see some big changes before the War Within goes live, so keep your eyes peeled for class changes and balanced tuning as we approach the release date. What do you think of our list? Is there anything you would completely disagree with, and where would you put your favourite specs? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and to all of our members here on YouTube. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can find links in the description or click the join button just below the video. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful in any way, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you're always kept up to date. Thanks for watching, folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.